My name is Elisabeth Druel. I'm the EU project manager at Blue Marine Foundation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. We are organizing this event in cooperation with FishSec, the Fisheries Secretariat, and the Irish Wildlife Trust. And we are kindly hosted by MEP Isabella Lövin on my right. This event is about forage fish, kind of fish which is often ignored compared to other more iconic species such as cod or tuna, because it is a small fish. And we will hear today from 3 different case studies, one in the Baltic from FishSec, one in the Channel North Sea from Blue Marine Foundation, and one from Ireland from Irish Wildlife Trust. But before that, just a couple of housekeeping rules. So you have food, you have coffee, you have tea at the back of the room, so please help yourself. We have to leave the room by 2 sharp, so I will be strict with the timekeeping with the speakers. And I also want to mention that there will be a recording of the presentation made by the speakers, so I hope you are all comfortable with that. And now let me introduce MEP Isabella Lövin. You are MEP for Sweden from the Greens. You are returning MEP. You were here in 2013 for the adoption of the Common Fisheries Policy, so you know the fisheries topic really well. Thank you very much for hosting us. You are a member of the PESH committee and of the Sea Rica Intergroup. Mrs. Lövin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, great big thanks to the 3 NGOs, Fisheries Secretariat, Irish Wildlife Fund and Blue Marine Foundation for your work and for taking this initiative. So I'm really, really happy to be hosting all of you here, and all your important voices who all of you represent are really, really needed, I think, at this moment. I remember when I started out as a journalist writing a book about overfishing back in 2000. It was published in 2007. And I learned the concept of fishing down the food web. Daniel Pauly and others have coined that expression. And that's exactly what we're seeing now in the Baltic Sea. So first you go for the big iconic fish, as you mentioned, the tuna, the cod, the salmon, the big ones. And when you do that, when you reduce those, then you will probably have a lot more of their food down the food chain. And in the Baltic, we saw the collapse of the cod, which was the big commercial fisheries during the 1970s to 1990s, with some years 800,000 tons of catches of cod, then 600,000, and then 400,000, and down and down and down. Now we're down to like almost 0, only bycatch. So this has been a really, really big tragedy. But in the same time, wow, more sprat and herring, because there's no cod to eat them. So we had also an increase of industrial trawling, most of it going to fish meal and fish oil to salmon farms and even mink farms in Finland. But we also have to realize the importance of these species, as you point out, in the whole ecosystem. They're kind of the center of the ecosystem, just eating the small plankton and stuff down the food web, and being also food for everything from seabirds to salmon and all the predator fish. So without this kind of center of the whole motor of the ecosystem, what will we have? We don't want to know what will happen, but just now we had the presentation in the PESH committee about the development of the big pelagic stocks in the Baltic Sea, the herring, the different stocks, but all of them are in a free fall. One has already collapsed, besides the cod, and we need to have much more precaution, building up biomass again, and looking at age and size structures, and having more resilient species of these fish. Otherwise, the Baltic Sea does not have a standard chance. I think that's everything we need to know about that. So thank you so much for these reports. I will look very closely at your recommendations as well, since I'm the rapporteur of the implementation report of the multi-annual plan for Baltic fish stocks, including herring and sprat. And we will start that work in a few weeks in committee. We'll see how it lands, but I do hope that we will have a strong message from this Parliament to Council and to the Commission that we need a total reset on how we manage, to the extent we can manage. I mean, how we have to kind of step back and let the Baltic Sea rest, and its important species do the same. And I'll start also by saying I'm so glad to see you here. Unfortunately, I have to leave very quickly, so I don't want to be sound not interested. I'm extremely interested. I will listen to the recording and read the reports afterwards. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lövin. So we will have now 3 presentations, and there will be the opportunity to have a Q&A session at the end of the 3 presentations. And the first presentation will be a presentation of the report that you can see on the table. Small fish with a big impact. And we have here with us in the room the authors of the report. Lina Birgersson, scientific expert working for the Fishery Secretariat, FishSec, and Cathrine Pedersen, also senior policy advisor at FishSec. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we at FishSec are happy to be here today to present our project and our new report. As said, you have them in front of you, but you can also find them online. The project is called Small Fish, Big Impact, and this is something we started after our cod project around 2 years ago. And the main output of this project is to produce the report, so the research step and the writing and then distribution steps for the report and different activities linked to that. And we are also working on following events during the fisheries management year, such as the release of ICES advice and the upcoming October Council. And the aim of this project is to give an overview of the scientific knowledge that exists for the Baltic Sea forage fish, mainly like sprat and herring, and to give recommendations for their management. So the report is built on a literature review, a systematic review done with predefined search criteria as you would in a review paper using the Scopus database. And then we got a large number of hits or results, and we sorted them by relevance using the predefined criteria. And then we also included grey literature that's not gone through peer-reviewed process, but ICES reports, for instance. So as this is based in a review, it will not be new data, but it will probably be quite familiar information for those of you that are familiar with the Baltic Sea stocks. These are an example of topics that are being researched based on our literature review. I try to lump them together in different groups. So on the left here we have the ecosystem related group with forage fish and their importance as prey for different predator species in the Baltic, their role in the ecosystem, how the ecosystem in the Baltic is changing and has changed. The competition between planktivores, sprat and herring, which can have an effect on their growth and condition, for example. Their diet, so they in turn also act as predators, I'll get back to that, feeding on zooplankton, for example, and the availability and composition of their food is going to affect their condition as well. And then with the increasing amounts of stickleback in the Baltic, a lot more studies have been published on stickleback's interactions with other fish, including sprat and herring. And then there are some biological studies, often also linked to the other groups. For instance, on condition and growth linked to climate change, studies such as that. The group in the middle down is for external factors that are stressing man-made issues that have been a problem in the Baltic for a long time. So pollution, we know, and eutrophication has been an issue. And even if some pollution is getting better, others are emerging, so there's still work to be done. And then there's of course also papers looking at fishing and management and consumption of these fish. So we chose, of course, sprat and herring because these are important forage fish in the Baltic Sea, and that's also reflected in the publications. They are the most common pelagic species in the area and also a big part of the biomass, particularly in the southern part, and they have a high economic importance as well. Together with cod, they're the traditionally targeted commercial species in the Baltic Sea, and now we don't really have the cod anymore, so they're the top, and that's reflected in the amounts of studies for these three species. The sprat started to increase around the 90s, especially when the eastern Baltic cod started to decline. You could see a big boom in the sprat, and the system became more sprat dominated. The majority of these are used for industrial processing. And for the herring, they are as well, but there's also the cultural importance with many dishes in different countries around the Baltic, which are have been used for a long time. In Sweden, for instance, we have the pickled herring that's always a staple on the midsummer and Christmas table, and the fermented herring as well. Sprat, it's managed as one single unit, which you might know, whereas herring is split into 4 management units or stocks. The Bothnian herring in the north, the Gulf of Riga herring in the Gulf of Riga, and the Central Baltic herring in the largest area, and the Western Baltic spring spawning herring. But there are in fact more populations than this that are genetically distinct, but they're managed as 4. And these are the most recent graphs from ICES showing the spawning stock biomass for the 4 Baltic Sea herring stocks. I don't expect you to be able to see this in detail. I just wanted to show the declining slope of 3 of these, with the western spring spawning herring doing particularly poorly, and it has been for a long while. So we want to avoid the other ones going the same way, because that's well below safe biological limits. Whereas the Gulf of Riga herring stands out because it's a healthy stock, above reference values, and doing well. The sprat has also been quite stable since this boom that you can see here in the beginning from the 90s, but it's been declining somewhat lately, and that's because of the poor recruitment for 3 consecutive years that we can see on the right. I've circled it. And it's common that sprat recruitment varies, but not that it's so low for several years in a row, so that's a bit worrying. The latest one is a bit higher, but then there's tied to some uncertainty. And there's also, as ICES themselves say in their assessments, misreporting, which is an ongoing problem for both stocks, both misreporting between them and also with flounder. So we heard the cultural and the economic relevance of these fish, but they're also of course very ecologically important, being both the prey for larger species and predators of the smaller planktons, and they act as a link bringing energy and nutrients upwards in the food web or on the trophic levels. In the Baltic Sea, there are fewer predator species feeding on them than in, say, the North Sea, for example, because it's a less complex system. It's quite species poor with the difficult salinity gradient, for instance, and temperature in there. So cod, of course, is something that's looked at a lot because of the link to forage fish and also the big commercial importance of it. Salmon as well, another popular food species. Pike is not as studied, but there are studies looking at the effect of lesser amounts of herring on pike, which is negative then. And then there are other studies looking at marine mammals and seabirds as well. And then we have the stickleback, which does not feed on adult forage fish because it's smaller than them, but it can be an issue for their eggs and also competition. I will very briefly go through a few of these now, and then you can read more in the report. Cod, as we heard from Isabella as well, has been a very important fish for the Baltic Sea, but has collapsed. And it's been suggested that one of the issues behind this is the lack of food. And also the interaction then between these species, sprat, herring, and cod, is among the most studied for the entire Baltic, or is the most studied. And we also have a previous report on this on our webpage on Baltic Sea cod that you can look at if you want. When it comes to salmon, they also eat both sprat and herring, but many studies are looking at the effects this has on their reproduction and the disorders that salmon can have. So the M74, for instance, is a disorder that's affecting the reproduction, and it's linked to thiamine deficiency, which is vitamin B1. And if they don't have enough of this, then their fry might not survive. So it's very important, of course. And if the adult salmon are feeding mainly on a diet of young sprat, they will have less thiamine per energy consumed. So it's linked to their fat diets. And that's going to be an issue for them. And stickleback, as I said, it's been increasing a lot in the Baltic Sea, and that's reflected in the publications. One reason for this is the lack of the larger predators. So predation decline means that stickleback is increasing more and more. It's also creating feedback loops by feeding on the eggs of other fish. There is some diet overlap between stickleback and sprat and herring, particularly herring, so they can compete. And there's also the issue with egg predation. So together with perch and to some extent the round goby, stickleback is a problem when it comes to egg predation. But then there's also newer studies that have looked at herring as a piscivorous predator. So there are large herrings along the Swedish coast, for example, that are able to feed on young stickleback, then have a big diet of them actually. Around 60% of their stomach content was found to be juvenile sticklebacks. So they then might be a good regulator of the amounts of sticklebacks present, and it's important to preserve this genetically unique population of large herrings, slaughter seal. And here we have a simplified overview of different stressors that are affecting the Baltic Sea forage fish. And this is of course going to change somewhat, but depending on where in the Baltic Sea you are, so it's not the same in the Botnian Bay as in the western Baltic Sea, for example. And some of these are actually positive to some extent, so increased temperature can increase growth to a certain extent, and then there's heat stress and other issues that are going to be negative. And sprat, for example, is better at handling higher temperatures than herring is. And then they're also linked together directly and indirectly. So climate change is of course affecting the availability of food, because some zooplankton are not able to handle changes in salinity and higher temperatures, and if they are not available, then the fish will starve. So fishing, of course, is one of the factors, but it's not the only one, and it's a complex situation where everything needs to be taken into account, and we can't just turn climate change off, so we need to keep this in mind when managing these fish. With that, I'll hand over to Cathrine.
Thank you, Lina. And now we are looking at some of the policy recommendations. I've picked a few also in line with that we are in the Parliament, and the European Parliament is a co-legislator and has some power in this and some say, and can also put pressure on the Commission and the Council to change things. So what do we need to do first? So first of all, we need to change the way we are receiving the advice. We have at the moment a very basic way of managing fisheries. So we have annual quotas, and this is a very complex plan, but it's basically showing you that we have, in the spring, we have ICES, so the International Council for the Exploration of Sea, who is producing assessment and models in order to provide recommendations on how much fish we can take out yearly, which is then decided with the Council is deciding it, but the Commission is the one that is proposing what levels the fishing limit should be at, and then the Council towards autumn, now actually in 2 weeks' time, will sit together and decide the quota. And the scientific advice looks a bit like this. I've just provided you the headline advice, and it basically says, ICES advises, in accordance with the plans that we have, the fishing limit should be between this and this range. And then this is based on a maximum sustainable yield model. And this is the model. It's very simple. We look at how much can we take out without that the stock is suffering, collapsing, basically. It's a very simple model. In a way, it's like really looking at humans how much one can take out of one single species. And so basically it looks a bit like this. I've borrowed this from the ISIS, from Carr. He's done this presentation before. So if you have very few vessels and a lot of stock, yeah, your yield will be not so much. You have a few more vessels and a lot of stock, you have the optimal, the maximum, where the arrow is. But then if you have too many vessels, too much effort, of course the fish population is going down and you have, yes, less yield. So it's a very basic model of management. And what this is taken from NOAA, so the American organization looking at fishing management. And at the moment we are here, so looking at single species management. So we are looking at how much can we take out of herring without looking at the interaction that is between herring and sprat that Lina has just highlighted, or between salmon and herring and the reproduction, the importance of the diet. So we are very much at the lower level at the moment in the terms of input that goes into the scientific advice that is informing the decisions on fishing opportunities. We need to, at the very least, get to this, the EBFM. So we look at the interaction of species, climate, the habitat, and predators. Ideally, we would want to be even one higher, which looks at also other interactions that happens at sea, very relevant in the Baltic and also in the North Sea with oil and gas and wind energy. But at the moment, we are very much at the basic level of input. But there is hope, because just 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, ISIS had their annual conference, and DG Mare, together with ISIS, sat together and looked at what can we do in the Baltic. And basically, they have come up with a joint statement, and they have decided, or they have declared, okay, true, if we have uniform single species management based on single species models, that is not going to address the issues in the Baltic. We need to therefore truly make an operational system to implement ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management. This is a really big first step, but a lot of steps have to happen then, of course, into operationalizing this into scientific advice. But I just want to highlight this, there is progress being made and it's looking good. And when we are talking to ISIS, also they're saying, we have a lot of the data, but the commission who is asking ISIS to provide this data needs to ask the right questions. Mm-hmm. So that is the first step. The commission and member states have to ask the right question to ISIS. So move from single species catch limits to multi-species ecosystem advice. Also, another important element is what we have at the moment is the advice is, as I said, how much can we take out? But we are not looking at how much do we need to take out a maximum in order to make sure that the stock is recovering. So the recovery element is totally missing from the current management regime. So we need to have models that are aiming at rebuilding the stocks because, as we know, Isabella mentioned it, Lina mentioned it, the stocks are in dramatic declines. We have 3 fisheries that are closed, totally closed. The only healthy stock is the Gulf of Riga, but also sprat is going down, the central herring is going down, and the flatfish, we have a lot of flatfish, but they are thin and small, so there are also alarm bells ringing there. So what we need to have is really targets for rebuilding stocks, and that is something that the Commission has the power to ask ISIS to incorporate that in their advice. We have worked very hard together with a lot of other organizations, also with the small-scale fishers and the anglers, to provide a comprehensive briefing on what kind of steps and what kind of advice do we need. So there's a link there. I will send around this presentation. And in there we have detailed steps of what ISIS can do, what the Commission can do, and what councils can do to ask the right question to get the advice we need to rebuild stocks. Then, until we have that, because there's a lot of time that will go until we have a true ecosystem-based advice, we need to reduce the current fishing pressure. And we need to make sure that we are always underneath what ISIS is saying. We need to be well underneath the maximum level in order to account for the species interactions, because as I said, they are not accounted for at the moment. The misreporting, something that is also outlined in the catch. We have a huge problem in the pelagic fisheries that some species are reported as another. So for example, we have in the sprat fishery, sometimes they are missing quotas, so they are reporting herring as sprat, and that of course means that a lot more sprat is taken out because the scientific advice is also relying on logbook data and on landing data. So because of all these uncertainties also in the science and the species interaction, we need to make sure we have quotas well below the FMSY level. We need to have recovery plans, and this is very important in the Baltic. We need to have a mechanism that if a stock falls below a certain threshold, automatically it will start a recovery plan. And ICES has done a great work already to look at how we could rebuild this. It's called Wiki Rebuild. There are working groups going on at the moment, and looking at what kind of catch composition, harvest control rules could one adapt in order to make sure the stocks recover within very clear timeframes. So you need to have targets. That is something that we don't have at the moment. We don't have a clear time frame by when a stock needs to be recovered. And then an important point is, in order to avoid the yo-yo effect that we have at the moment, also once a stock is having a great recruitment, we see that with sprat at the moment, oh yes, everyone is asking for higher quotas, but we need to make sure there is some stabilities and we have at least 3 years consecutive low levels of harvesting in order to rebuild the stock. And then a very boring message, but implement, because actually we have a lot of these rules already in the common fisheries policy. We have in the common fisheries the need to base science on the best available newest advice. We need to have, we have also in the common fisheries the need to have a precautionary approach to fisheries management. And we have also rules that make sure that we don't go underneath these biomass safeguard provisions in the Baltic multi-annual plans that make sure that we don't go below a certain threshold where the biomass is in danger. These rules need to be implemented, and that is the council that needs to be reminded by by civil society and by the parliament that these rules need to be implemented. Also very important, as I mentioned again before, we have issues with control in the Baltic. We have high amounts of discards both in demersal fisheries, but also we have this problem of misreporting that I mentioned earlier in the pelagic fishery. We need to implement the rules of the control regulations, and we need to use the rules that are available. Remote electronic monitoring, it's a technology that's been available for 20 years now, but it's not being implemented. We have also new technologies like environmental DNA that can be used to identify what kind of species are in the catch. So these technologies exist, but we have to have the political will to implement them. And these were just 3 of the recommendations. We have more recommendations in the report, but I didn't want to overload you. So thank you very much for your attention, and pick up a report and enjoy the reading.
Thank you very much, Lina and Cathrine. It was fascinating. I now move to my colleague, Juliette, Dr. Juliette Scott. You are a lawyer working in the legal unit at Blue Marine Foundation, and you have followed very closely the EU-UK sandeel case, and you will give us an overview of the case and analysis of the case, if the presentation works. Yes,
I think it does. Should I? Do you want? Should I?
So, you'll be pleased to know that I followed this case very closely. In fact, I was in the courtroom, and I read about 2,000 pages of pleadings, but you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to talk about that. I would like to use the case as a way of learning and also echoing what Catherine's just been saying about fisheries management. So the first thing to point out, which is a little bit strange, is that the parties, the dispute, although it was basically environmental measures against fisheries, it was brought under a trade agreement, under the so-called Brexit agreement. So we have these three things going along: trade, environment and fisheries, which is a little bit unusual. The case was heard in The Hague at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and the result was a good example of arbitration judges being very, very politic, and sort of they gave the opportunity for all three really to sort of say that they had taken something away. But as I said, I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about are the issues that came out of the case during the 2 days of debate and the long and large number of pages exchanged. So the first thing is, what is best scientific advice exactly, legally? What is the precautionary approach? How does ICES advice get used? Then I'm going to talk about one-shot measures versus stability, and finally about siloing of law and regulations and holistic governance. So first of all, what constitutes best scientific advice? Well, for the PCA judges, the arbitration judges, they were not asked by the parties to redo the science, but simply to establish a standard of evidence. They also talked about what attributes of ICES advice are there compared to other organisations. So they were saying, well, maybe ICES isn't the reference in the world. ICES itself, in the report to the parties, said that it does not take into account the ecosystem. It actually said it itself. So worldwide, there is no consensus. The United States National Research Council says it can be interpreted in a number of ways, depending on whether the emphasis is quality or timeliness. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the Brexit Agreement, says that the advice should principally be provided by ICES, so no help there. And the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea says simply best available scientific evidence and gives no definition. The same situation applies to the precautionary approach. No consensus. So the European Commission devoted a 28-page communication on the fact that it's not clear. And this is a quote from it. So it gives rise to much debate, sometimes contradictory views, and there's a dilemma of balancing the rights of individuals, industry and organisations with the need to reduce adverse effects on the environment. And even in terms of terminology, some international organisations refer to the precautionary principle and others to the precautionary approach. And still other organisations differentiate between the two and say that maybe the approach is more flexible and has less legal weight. In the TCA, in the Brexit agreement, we have some lovely double negatives. So the absence of adequate information does not justify postponing. So just, you can get your brain quite tied in knots trying to work out what that exactly means. Just a couple of examples of very big international, the Canadian government, the NOAA in the States and OSPAR, no consensus at all. And in fact, the International Institute for Sustainable Development says there is no uniform understanding of its meaning, components are still evolving, and it continues to generate disagreement as to its meaning and effect. So my question to you is, does the principle dictate that uncertainty demands action, which is what you might think about a precautionary measure? Or does this uncertainty justify inaction? That's the dangerous bit. Governments, maybe even the UK government, use it to justify not doing anything. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about very much what Cathrine was talking about. Seeking ICES advice, framing it and using it appropriately. So ICES itself says, advice from ICES only covers part of the overall fisheries management system. Quota advice needs to be part of an overall management regime. Existing levels may or may not be appropriate for ensuring good provision of ecosystem services. So here this is ICES itself. I'm quoting verbatim. So a large part of the question of whether management is supporting ecosystem functions will occur at the level of national regulations. And as Cathrine said, it's really important to ask ICES the right questions, and ICES itself says this. In the joint parties' request in the Sandeels dispute, the EU and the UK wrote a request to ICES for what we've termed as called the technical service, and it said the request lacks specification of objectives for ecosystem considerations. So if you don't ask the right question, you don't get the right answer. And in ICES framework for ecosystem informed science and advice from 2024, it also says various types of data, knowledge and information that may differ greatly in format, precision, availability, spatial, temporal scale, quality and confidence all affect what ICES can return. So the suggestion is to expand the request for ICES advice beyond single species, as Cathrine clearly said, improve scientific advice structure to better highlight the uncertainties and risks, and ensure that headline advice aligns with legal obligations. So how about one-shot measures versus stability? And here the UK is an expert at being bad. The ecosystem approach would say that ecosystems encompass all players operating in a value chain. And this also applies to industry, outside fisheries, outside our context completely. From the smallest businesses to the largest companies, from academia to research to suppliers. This is how an ecosystem should work. The notion of ecosystems implies a complex set of interlinkages and interdependencies. So using this approach actually has benefits for the fishing sector, and we haven't talked about that so far today. Although parts of the fishing industry were lobbying very strongly in the Sandeels dispute, a long-term approach is actually more beneficial to them than anybody else. The future generations of fishermen, the continuing availability of stocks, the integration of fisher knowledge on where fish stocks are going, inclusivity in fishing, dynamic and evolving situations, they can have input there, and also the balancing of competing interests in different parts of the fleet. So here, if we can manage it, the environment and the fishing sector should actually be on the same page. My last point is about siloing and holistic governance. So in America, we have the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. So in the title, in its very title, it has environment and fisheries together. in the EU, this is not really the case. We have DG Environment and we have DG Mare. A good start would be to put those together, and we have an example actually in Jersey where the government realised this was a bit strange and ordered the ministries to work together. And my last point about siloing is that this is a picture of the sandeel, the management areas, and so we have the UK area and the EU areas and so on. But the important point in this is not what the map areas. The important thing is that sandeel swim wherever they want. So the idea of siloing in management is completely nuts. They're swimming in the background in case you don't see them. So I'd just like to finish on this dystopian view of the future where we have offshore wind, we have nuclear, we have undersea activities, we have all sorts of things going on, versus a sustainable future. And the only way, absolutely the only way to manage all of this is fully integrating all aspects of the ecosystem, not even limiting ecosystem approach to something which is just about fisheries, but every player involved, as you would in an ecosystem approach in other industries. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Juliette. And now I will turn to Grace. So Grace Carr, you are a marine biologist. You are advocacy officer for the Irish Wildlife Trust, and you work on sustainable sprat in Ireland. So over to you, Grace.
Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Grace Carr, and I'm the Marine Advocacy Officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. So the Irish Wildlife Trust is an environmental NGO based in Ireland, and our mission is to help protect and restore nature, and also to help support people to have a greater understanding and appreciation for nature as well. So my talk today is going to be looking at the fight for sustainable sprat fishing in Irish waters, and specifically focusing on the 6 nautical miles around our coast. So looking at a lot of reasons why there's issues like a lack of management, no total allowable catch and unfair quota, and how this is having a really negative impact on the marine environment and inshore fishing communities. So all my colleagues have already talked really well about the importance of forage fish. I'm sure everybody here knows the importance of forage fish, just for the entire marine food web as well. And in Ireland we're so lucky to have such a broad range of biodiversity. Like, we've so many species of commercially valuable fish, seabirds, and we're in the middle of migratory routes for so many different types of cetaceans. It's amazing to be able to see that there's minke whales and humpback whales that come right into our bays. So they are reliant on forage fish, and sprat is one of our main ones of that. So with that in mind, here are some of the facts relating to the Irish case. So sprat fishing is currently completely unregulated in Irish waters. There's no quota for sprat, so people can catch as much sprat as they want. There's no management plan in place, and unfortunately we've had no scientific stock assessment done, so we have absolutely no idea about the status of the sprat. So with that in mind, the only thing we have is the ICES recommendations, and everyone has spoken very clearly about the issues around the ICES recommendation. They don't take into ecosystem-based approach. But unfortunately at the moment, because we don't have any stock assessment done, sprat in Irish waters, that's all that we have. So for the last few years, ICES recommendation for sprat was 2,250 tonnes. This has never been adhered to in Irish waters, and in fact last year over 7.5 times more sprat was actually landed, so it was somewhere close to 17,000 tonnes of sprat. And out of the 17,000 tonnes, only around 2% was for human consumption, and the rest was for fish meal. So not very commercially valuable either. They don't get very high prices for having fish turned into fish meal. And it's absolutely insane that such an important, vital fish is being taken out of the food web to then be turned into mush, to turn it into fish meal, to then go into salmon farms in Ireland, salmon aquaculture, which is a really ecologically destructive practice in Ireland as well. But that's a whole other presentation for a whole other day. So that's the situation we're dealing with at the moment. This isn't something new that we have been advocating for, and it's not just us. There's environmentalists, researchers and members of the fishing community that have been advocating around this issue for a long time. So I'll give you a very brief rundown of it. There was a public consultation in 2018 on this, and in 2019 the then minister announced that there would be a ban on vessels over 18 metres from trawling within the 6 nautical mile zone, and this was going to come into force in 2020. So this was very exciting at the time. You know, we don't really have a lot of management measures in Ireland for fisheries or for, you know, just marine conservation in general. So this was something that was very much welcomed, but a judicial review was taken, and it was taken by 2 fishermen in Ireland against the minister's directive, so the ban was overturned. It was then temporarily reinstated again in 2021 after a court of appeal, but then again in 2023 the ban was overturned again. And I just want to point out, it wasn't overturned because new research had come to light, or, you know, we knew the status of the stock, or it was found out that it wasn't, you know, good for the marine environment, it wasn't ecologically viable. It was overturned on a legal technicality, so literally some red tape that wasn't adhered to by the government, and that's why it was overturned. So from 2023, sprat fishery was completely unregulated, unrestricted, unmanaged in Irish waters. So there was outcry over this, and environmental NGOs, and the inshore fishing fleet actually came together and did a joint statement to the government asking for them to do something about this. So finally then, at the beginning of 2024, there was another public consultation launched, and there was over 5,500 responses to this, which is a huge amount in Ireland. It took about a year and a half for them to come up with any measures, so they announced new measures there at the end of July of this year, and these are the measures that they came up with. So vessels over 18 metres will have a quota of 2,000 tonnes for sprat starting from October of this year. And from October of next year, the ban will be back in place, and they'll be excluded from trawling within the 6 nautical miles of the coast. So to give you an idea of what the 6 nautical miles look like, it goes from the baselines. So the baselines is the black line that's hugging the coast and goes between headland to headland. And then the 6 nautical miles is the red line that goes out from that. And I just want to point out as well that the areas in purple and pink, those are some of our protected areas in Irish waters. So you can see that a lot of them are concentrated within this 6 nautical mile zone. So are these measures enough to protect inshore ecosystems and inshore fishing communities? And the short answer to that is no, definitely not. It's too little too late at this point. The total allowable catch for vessels over 18 metres has actually been set higher than the ICES advice for 2025. So the new advice from ICES for this year is actually lower than 2,000 tonnes, and that's what the TSE has been set for the larger vessels. There's also no sort of plan in place for how this is going to be managed, again, because again, you know, landings can be declared as herring or something else, so there's no real clear path about how this is going to be monitored. It also doesn't take into account how much will be caught by the vessels under 18 metres as well. So there's no management plan for sprat, and the government has actually come out and said that these measures are not intended to be a fisheries management measures. These measures were put in place to support the inshore fishing sector. So while it does support some of the inshore sector, not all of them fish for sprat, only maybe around 20 boats fish for sprat. It's very, very short-sighted as well. It's not an actually well thought out management measure, as we all know, like, it's not going to work in the long run. And if you speak with any sort of inshore fishermen, anyone that I've spoken to, they'll all say as well that if there's no management plan and there's no restrictions in place, it can only lead to bad things. So it's really kind of, they're like putting a bandage on a massive wound. It's not a viable way to truly support the inshore sector. one of the good things about the ban is it is kind of like a broad management measure. So in Ireland, we still don't have national marine protected area legislation. All of our protected areas, which I showed you on the previous slide, they're designated under the EU Birds and Habitats Directive. And unfortunately, the vast majority of these, they're lacking site-specific management plans. And that is something that we would, we'd much prefer to have site-specific management plans for our protected areas. And environmental NGOs are advocating for new marine protected area legislation, and they're asking for these site-specific plans to be in place, and also to have early and ongoing stakeholder engagement as well in the designation and monitoring process to make sure that everyone's brought along. But unfortunately, this has not happened so far by the government. So at the moment, this ban on vessels trawling, and it includes bottom trawling as well as midwater trawling, it is a broad management measure, and it will have some ecological benefits for sure. So why are these measures not enough? What are some of the real underlying issues? So the big one would be Article 17 of the Common Fisheries Policy not being implemented in Ireland. So I'm sure you all know about Article 17. It's about quota sharing, and it says that quotas should be allocated in a fair and transparent way, and that criteria looking at social, ecological and economic criteria should all be taken into account, and that vessels that are fishing more sustainably, they should be incentivised. So this is just not happening in Ireland at all. There are 1,950 registered vessels in Ireland. Not all of these are active. 1,800 of these are actually under 18 metres, and over 1,400 of these are under 10 metres. So bearing that in mind, there's around 23 boats that actually get 80 to 90% of the quota species in Ireland. So that's a huge disparity there, and completely unfair. So a lot of our inshore fishermen and island communities, they're highly reliant on non-target species such as sprat as well. And there's no management plans, or very little management plans in place for inshore species. So one big one would be the brown crab, and inshore fishermen have been advocating for a management plan for this for years, but the government just doesn't seem to be prioritising this. So a lot of our smaller vessels are having to use potting as a method. And obviously potting is a static gear, it should be more low impact, it should be more sustainable. But because of the sheer number of vessels that are having to deploy this method, it's now no longer low impact in our waters. So it's very, very hard to talk about a just transition. So moving away from destructive practices like bottom trawling, there's a few vessels, in the inshore sector that still bottom trawl, but if we take bottom trawling away from them, they're not getting the quota to fish other species, so they will be forced to move into potting. So you're taking away one destructive practice to move them into another destructive practice. So it's just, it just won't work. So how are we supposed to move to more sustainable fishing? So some of our key asks, the main one would be fair quota sharing among vessels, like full implementation of Article 17. I think most people could agree that they'd much prefer to see, a majority of a fishing fleet making a good, decent living, rather than a handful of people making millions, which is what's happening at the moment. Also asking for management plans for inshore species using the ecosystem-based approach, and we are crying out for a full scientific analysis on the status of sprat, because how are we supposed to fish sustainably if we've no idea how the species is doing? And we would also like to have a cumulative impact report done if sprat was taken out of the marine ecosystem. So not just looking at the ecological impacts, which would be awful, but also looking at the socio-economic impacts, because the impacts it will have on the other commercial fisheries as well. So I'll leave you with a wee bit of good news as well anyway. So at the moment, there are NGOs and volunteers on the ground that are actually coming together to start fundraising, to get money together, to get universities in Ireland involved to do their own scientific analysis. So that will take quite a lot of money, because it'll have to be done over a good few years. We'll have to take the fishing industry along as well, and it'll have to be done in different areas around Ireland because our ecosystem is so diverse. So yeah, it's something that the government should be doing. They should be prioritising it, but they're not. So it's good to see that there are so many people that care about this. They care about the marine environment, they care about our inshore fishing sector, that they're actually going out of the way themselves to get the money so that we can finally find out the status of sprat. So change will happen, but it looks as though change is going to be happening from the bottom up. Okay, Gurmi Malaga.